Hey everybody, Craig Campbell from NerdBurger Games here, and I just published Capers Noir, which is the first supplement for the award-winning Capers RPG. Award-winning, ooh, that still sounds really weird to say, but it's the truth, I guess. The point is that I published a supplement, and that's always a little bit of a dicey prospect for little bitty RPG, indie RPG kind of things, because supplements typically don't sell as well as a core game. They're a little hard to to cover funding wise and to make happen. They're a lot of work for potentially very little reward. Capers Noir, however, the Kickstarter did very well. I got quite a bit more support from existing fan base than I kind of expected. And I thought I'd just walk a little bit around like how I went from having like the Capers game, which was intended to be just a single game book, maybe with a short PDF here and there as support, into actually deciding to create full-on supplements, because that was not originally the plan. Originally, Capers was just going to be a one-shot book that was going to be 160, 170 pages, and it would give you the whole game in there. During the Kickstarter, what happened was some of the backers started asking, like, is there going to be support? Is there going to be a game line? Is there going to be supplements? And I had not really thought about that as a viable alternative or viable option because of the reasons I talked about. And so I thought, well, it can't hurt to see if it seems workable. So I threw a Google poll, into an update at one point, and asked people to chime in and let me know if they would be interested in supporting future Kickstarters for supplements for Capers. And to my surprise, I got like a little over 100 people of the backers to say, yeah, they'd be in for that. And given that the backer count ended up around a little over 500, that's like 20% of the backers, which I thought was actually kind of a pretty good chunk. And I did some number crunching and thought about like what a supplement might look like, how big it might be, what potentially a Kickstarter for a supplement might look like in terms of effort and in terms of money, and thought, okay, I'll give it a shot. So I started planning. And the first hurdle I hit, the kind of thing that was like, well, what are the supplements going to be? You obviously want to provide additional material for the game, but there's a lot of ways to do that. And there are a lot of games where the supplements tend to be, here's a big book of player options. Characters can have all these extra things. There's like new equipment and new spells and new this and that. And you can have GM supplements that are along those lines, but for GMs, where there's like, here's a whole bunch of new monsters, a whole bunch of pre-prepared NPCs, here's some extra tools and advice and guidelines and counter building tips and all those sorts of things. And I thought, well, given that the Capers book is a player and GM all in one book, I figured the supplement should probably give a little bit of something to players and to GMs. But I didn't want to just say, okay, well, here's a book of options, here's a book of additional character stuff, and just expand the existing setting, the existing game. I thought, I could do like describe more cities, like include more backdrop information for GM. So like maybe have a larger city write up for a couple more cities in the 1920s Prohibition game that is Capers. And then it kind of struck me, well, I could take it and start to progress a timeline forward. So I started to explore that idea, and I thought, well, if I took it like a generation at a time, what would it be like one generation after these superpowered individuals started showing up? What would this alternate history look like? And that took me from the 20s to the 40s, and that took me into the World War II era. And I found myself thinking, well, okay, what's interesting about the 40s? Prohibition is over, so this is still going to be a game about gangsters and cops and federal agents and so forth, but it's not the Prohibition era, so it needs a new hook. And I hit on the idea of like, well, what if I went noir? What if I took it to like your those kind of fun 40s and 50s crime noir films where it's a lot of mystery, a lot of mood and atmosphere. Things kind of start one way and they turn into something else. There's always, twists and turns, and the femme fatale is never really who she says she is, except when she is sometimes, and they twist that around. I thought that was kind of cool. That's fun. But what else can I do? What else can I do? And I bounced around like, okay, well, I could do this kind of spooky, take the shadows and darkness of noir and actually make it spooky. What if there's ghosts? And I'm like, well, what does that mean? How does that work? And that rolled into the idea of, World War II kind of had a relatively devastating effect on the world, and the land of the dead, the world of the dead kind of crept a little closer to the world. And so monsters are in there. So there I had it. I had like, okay, I'm going to take the 40s. I'll provide an alternative setting with kind of a different thematic element. It'll be a noir story kind of setting instead of Prohibition age hijinks. And I can provide all sorts of new interesting character stuff that fits that setting and flavor, but also can just be used straight up in the core game. And then I'll have all this information about this alternative setting and some new GM material that can be utilized to build that alternative setting for players to take their characters into. And then there's even the potential for some of that stuff to just go ahead and take it into Capers. If the GM wants to have a revenant or a ghost or something show up in the 20s during Prohibition, there's nothing stopping them. So just that was the first idea, and so I thought, well, where do you go from there? So the 60s, let's jump another 20 years, and then I hit on the 60s to me is kind of a very political. A time of a great deal of political and social justice upheaval. There's a lot of rights movements that are kicking in, and I kind of built the idea that the capers, the superpowered individuals of the 20s who were kind of tabloid stars and media darlings, the general populace starts to become a little bit more wary of them as time progresses. And so kind of reversed all of that and used the 60s, where in the 40s they're kind of looked at a little sideways, like, do I want to trust these people? And then by the 60s they're out and out feared by a great many people, and the government is trying to regulate them and register them and kind of keep track of people who have these abilities, and let there be like the political side of it in there. And not, the game isn't about political activism, and it isn't about rights, but it is we can discuss it in the setting a bit, and if players and the GM want to take it in that direction and talk about capers rights activism and so forth, they certainly can. But the game is still very much about the conflict between criminals and law enforcement. In the 60s, to me, one of the defining features was the beginning of the James Bond movies. So I thought, now we've got superpowers with gadgets and like super spies and super villains who are superpowered. And that's a neat idea. So I built that idea out. And so we have this progression of like each supplement is a new era with new stuff in it, like a horror thing, and then in the 60s it's got gadgets and super spies and villains and crazy layers and all those sorts of things. So like each becomes like a thematic, like a little switch, and I kind of dug that because it harkened to some of the games that I really liked, like the World of Darkness had their alternate history stories where you had the modern day vampire game and then the Dark Ages game, and it was recognizable as vampire, but it was very Dark Ages. It had its thing. It had there was a lot of flavor to it that made it very Dark Ages, and each of those old World of Darkness games did that. And we've seen things like that a little bit with D&D lately, where they put out a book that's an adventure book that's in another part of the Forgotten Realms or in a different world altogether, but they also provide player options and information in there, so it's all kind of self-contained in one book. So it's not just like, here's a stack of new powers and spells and monsters and stuff. There's some depth and fun to it. And I thought, what about you take the 60s? Okay, let's bounce forward to the 80s. And it's like, now we're starting to get into modern day, and it starts to lose that yesteryear appeal that I think is one of the hallmarks of Capers, is that it does Capers feels like, you're the time of your parents and your grandparents and maybe even your great-grandparents. Whereas you get to the 80s and that starts to feel like that's like when I was a kid personally, and when a lot of gamers who are older out there who like they know the 80s. It's a little too close to home. So the 80s doesn't really, I might do something with the 80s in a smaller way, but I didn't want to necessarily just progress the everything forward. And I thought, well, I've got a trilogy of books. That's not too bad. Trilogies are nice. But I wonder if there's a way I can tie them all together. And I toyed around because I had already developed the idea of alternate Earths. And so I toyed around for a bit with the idea of like a plane hopping, world jumping kind of thing where it was like you could jump from like having something that allowed you to jump from time period to time period. And that seemed interesting and something I wanted to explore, but it also felt like it wasn't enough. It wasn't robust enough for an entire supplement because I was looking at these things as being, 60 or 70 pages. And it bounced into my head at one point, well, let's keep it in the history, let's keep it in the past, let's keep it with that old-timey feel. And how do you, like if you do time travel, there's probably also maybe space travel. So you can travel through time and space. And then that morphed very quickly in my head into an idea for taking Capers off-world, taking it out to the stars. And I bounced a few ideas for names around. Currently I've settled with Offworld, Capers Offworld. That might change. We'll see. But then that was like I could take it, okay, I can retro future this into sort of Buck Rogers, Flash Gordon, pulp era movie serial science fiction kind of territory. And we can have rocket ships that are shaped like footballs, kind of elongated footballs with fins on the back and, pew pew pew, laser guns, and we can have aliens and weird worlds and strange space hazards and megalomaniacal space villains that are looking to take everything over. And so if you're playing a law enforcement character, some galactic police department or whatever, you're looking to stop those evil galactic overlords. And if you're playing villainous characters, then maybe you are those evil galactic overlords, or you want to be. And so I bounced, that around a little bit, and I found that that sounds really interesting. I don't know that I've seen a lot of superheroes in space, and it also kind of completed the whole core book plus 3 of each book having a theme where you went from horror to super spy, and then this is sort of a science fiction where we'll have some science fiction technology and spaceships and a little bit of time travel, and then I kind of worked that all out in my head, and then I thought, well, now I've got to figure out all the little subsets of rules and new powers and things that I can add. That what I've described thus far kind of covers the GM side. I got to look at the character side, what the players are going to get, and so it was really brainstorming a lot of different alternate rules, some of which are kind of thematically appropriate to the individual supplements. Some of them are just interesting alternate kind of ways to do things that can be peppered in there, and people can use them if they want to. And powers turned out to be kind of a tricky one because I gave Capers most of the really noticeable, recognizable powers, a lot of the powers that you and I know from comic books and from superhero movies. There's a lot of them are in there. So I was like, well, now I'm going to be mining into some of the other areas of superpowers. And I thought, well, that's kind of, I wish I would have thought about doing all of this sooner. I would have maybe taken a few of those powers from Capers and saved them for later supplements as enticement. But the water was under the bridge, and I had to go with what I had. So in noir, there's some thematic stuff like possession and contacting spirits, and then there's the beginning of seeing powers that are a little more subtle. There's a lot of the flashy stuff is in Capers, so the subtle stuff is in there with the idea that people that are developing exhibiting these powers are starting to exhibit powers that might be more easily explained as coincidence. because other people, regular people, are starting to look at them a little weird, like maybe there's something wrong, maybe we should be afraid of these people. And then as you get into covert, there's more of those, but there are also some flashy kind of powers in there. But there's a lot of stuff where you can control the different elements, or you can control technology, and cause existing forces and objects and things to do different things. And then when I've got to Offworld, then I was like, all right, here we go. Now we'll do all the really crazy, weird stuff that like felt out of place in Capers, like having like Green Lantern style energy constructs where you've got this power where you can create like basically anything out of just pure energy and force, which felt way over the top and really not in keeping with Capers. But for a science fiction kind of thing, it makes a lot of sense. It works for me. So I started, I was able to hit on some of those, and then time control and some of those other things, something that affects gravity, just kind of built from there. And it took quite a while looking through a lot of online resources for different types of superpowers, trying to find all the right ones that kind of fit the bill, but also provided, like a few kind of big flashy powers, but then also some subtle stuff, and then go nuts when you get to Offworld and just go ahead and have some of the crazier stuff in there, the bigger, more flashy abilities. So that's kind of the background into all of that, how that happened, and that all sort of was spread out. There was an initial kind of working things out early on to see if I wanted to go to give it all a try, and then I got to, kind of close to Capers Noir, and everything seemed to be shaping up okay, and it play tested well. And I started to flesh out the other two books in some amount of, just like an outline with some detail. Didn't really start writing anything, but kind of had it well outlined. And then when Capers Noir funded in the first, in that first day, and it did very well in the first few days, I thought, okay, this is it. The floodgates are open. We're going to go ahead and start to flesh that stuff out more. And so I started thinking more closely, and then a lot more of the detail about what powers I was going to use and how to do different alternate rule systems. And, I wanted to include vehicle chase rules, but where was the right time to do that? So it's like, well, I could do that in Noir because you had cars and you could have car chases, but ultimately I decided it made more sense in Capers Covert, because it's very much like, what's a James Bond story without a good vehicle chase, without a car chase? So there's a lot of back and forth to figure out, like, what are the different things, where do I put them? And I did that over the course of like that first month, kind of while the Capers Noir Kickstarter was going on, and then in the last month or so, I've actually started to delve into writing a little bit of Offworld. Covert actually started to get written a little earlier because I wanted to get ahead of things so that I could play test quickly after Noir was squared away. And that's where we're at. That's kind of the basics of how all of that came about. Maybe you found that interesting. Maybe I just rambled a whole bunch to hear myself talk, but I find it kind of useful for me too to recount these sorts of things in my head and remind myself kind of where everything came from, how it is set up, where it might be going. And while I'm thinking and talking about this, maybe in the back of my head I find myself thinking, oh, there's something I'm missing, or I should do this different, or I tend to think a lot about stuff, is what I'm saying. I do get organized and very planning oriented. So I guess this was another tool that allowed me to do that, and maybe you found it interesting to take a walk through my design brain. So that's where that's at. Everything's going well. As of right now, Capers Covert is in playtesting, and Offworld is being written. So there's going to be 2 more, everybody. I hope you dig them. Take it easy. Bye.